to speak here. And like Greg said, my name is Derek Smith. I work for a company called RM Source, which is a consulting firm in Cary. And we're a Microsoft partner. We do a variety of custom software development, a lot of SharePoint work. We actually own our own data center located in Durham, and so we do manage hosting for clients and things like that. So I want to start tonight by talking about a book. And this was written in 1995 by a guy named Nicholas Negroponte, who's the founder of the MIT Media Lab. It's kind of a think tank, I guess you could think of it as. And he wrote this book called Being Digital. And in the book, he talks a lot about kind of the future of technology and kind of how our lives are going to change as technology takes hold in sort of the digital age. Again, this is 1995. And one of the kind of main themes in the book is this shift that he suggests from what he calls things based on atoms, that would be sort of physical, tangible objects, to bits, of course, meaning sort of the digital representation of these things. And so, for example, one of the things he talks about is music. And he talks about how there will be this shift from physical CDs to digital files. And in 1995, that was pretty ahead of his time, and he certainly got that right. And even in the book, he jokes about how the book itself will someday be replaced by an electronic version of the book. And so I started, I read this book and kind of was thinking about it in the context of being a software developer and how we see that trend in our industry. And really the primary, or one area that really represents this is security, right? So in my pocket, and probably your pocket, I have a keychain. Right? And so these keys represent the kind of physical, or in Negroponte's terms, the atomic representation of my ability to access something. And if I possess the key, then I can gain entry to the space. And so in the digital world, the sort of analog to that is really for software developers how we manage access and security and identity of our users. And the most typical manifestation of that, of course, is the login form. And we've gotten to a point in the web where this is a very predictable, very kind of reliable experience as a user. The pattern of the login form is very well formed now, with a username field, a password field, the remember me checkbox, the sign in button, the register link, and the forgot password link. I mean, those 6 elements are pretty reliable when you see an authentication prompt. And so this, of course, is Microsoft's version of that. We see Facebook's version of it. Here's Google's. And by the way, if you use Google, you might want to visit this and update your password. So there was a breach today they announced. But, again, it's a very reliable, very predictable kind of experience. And then a lot of the services we use have their form of this. Obviously banking, and we've even reached a point where your grocery store has a login form on the web, which I sort of think is interesting. And so again, for us as software developers, the login form itself, that's kind of the easy part, right? We draw the fields and we kind of handle the click event. But what we really concern ourselves with is what happens behind the form. What happens when we register a user? What happens when we try to authenticate a user, and how do we do that? And so that's where I kind of want to start the discussion tonight about identity management. There's really 2 kind of key themes or concepts that we deal with. So the first is authentication, and this is essentially the idea that we need to know who you are, if you are who you say you are. And again, we typically do this by presenting some identifying field, like a username, and then we ask you to prove that, right, by providing an additional piece of information, whether it's a password or a PIN number. And the idea there is obviously that second piece of information is something that only the owner of that identity would know. And so that's how we sort of test and prove that you are who you say that you are, and that you're not misrepresenting yourself as a user. The second theme then is authorization, and this really deals with, once we know who you are, we have to figure out what you have permission to do. And so this, again, in most systems is typically implemented using roles. So I might be a user and have very basic permission, or I might be granted an administrator kind of role and have elevated permission. Sometimes we do this in real time where we check against an access control list of some form. And I like to think of it kind of like the hallway in the Matrix, right? With this long corridor with lots of doors on it. And once I get into the hallway, that's authentication, right? I've been permitted in. I've proven that I can get in. But whether or not I can open any of the doors is kind of authorization, right? Do you have permission to enter this space? And so historically, as developers, for a long time, we just had to build our own handling for this, right? There weren't a lot of prefabricated components or standards in this area. And I mean, I remember as a junior developer right out of college writing code to like, bit shift password fields before I write them in a database, right? I mean, this was very sort of you do it yourself kind of area. And so then in 2005 is when Microsoft introduced the ASP.NET membership framework. And this came out as part of the .NET 2.0 release. And it's remarkable for me to think that this thing is 10 years old, or almost 10 years old now. And while it certainly has some quirks to it, it's proven, I think, to be a pretty enduring platform. And who currently develops with or has supported a platform based on membership, right? It's very well established as a jumpstart for getting your security models and getting your app authentication provisioned out. And so it's pretty flexible. It's a very basic kind of mechanism. But in 10 years, a lot's changed. So for example, this happened, right? So now we have social networks where the user population of these networks worldwide has grown. And so if you think about, the Venn diagram of people who are on a social network and people who might use my application, you get this really heavy overlap to that. And so it introduces an opportunity where we can sort of outsource authentication. We can say, well, you know about a lot of people already, so let me borrow your authentication process and let you do that, and you keep track of the users. And then once you verify that to me, I'll handle authorization. Okay, so we sort of can split the interest in that regard. And we can do that effectively, again, because these networks have such huge user bases built in, represented by them. The other big trend that's happening is, and again, Microsoft's clearly a player in this, is the shift towards cloud-based services. And so when you think about Windows Azure or Office 365 or OneDrive, these are all scenarios where now my application might need to provide authorization to some remote service, right? I've authenticated, but now I need to be granted permission to something that's external to my app. Or in the case of Windows Azure, I can actually now stand up an entire directory service in the cloud and use it as my credential store. So again, now I have sort of this external credential management, and my app needs to leverage that over the wire. And so again, it kind of has changed the landscape of how applications are developed and how security management can take place. And so in light of those trends, Microsoft in probably 2011, 2012, really said, how do we reform or rethink identity management kind of in the modern web era? And what they have produced is called ASP.NET Identity. This originally released, as we'll see in a moment, with Visual Studio 2013. And it really was a ground-up kind of rethinking of how membership management and authorization was going to be handled. And so the team had some pretty specific design goals for what, again, we have this opportunity to sort of start over based on the current modern web. So what are the things that are important to us? So one of the areas is improved user profile. So in my opinion, the weakest component of .NET membership is how it handles profiles. It feels like it was an afterthought. And anyone who's familiar with this sort of knows what I'm talking about, because while it natively will keep track of a username and an email address and a password and does that great, if you want to have any additional information about that user, the way that ASP.NET membership handles that is essentially through this kind of serialized packed SQL field. And so while it's extremely flexible, right, I can kind of put whatever value I want into that, it makes it very difficult for scenarios where I might want to query across my whole user base and say, well, give me everybody who has such and such a job title, or things like that, because the information is not accessible. It's not represented as a field in a database. So that was a real shortcoming of .NET membership. As we mentioned, also social login. How do we take advantage of the social networks, as well as native support for Azure Active Directory? Another big goal was improved persistence. So ASP.NET membership was heavily biased, or is heavily biased, towards a relational database, specifically SQL relational databases. And so if you have a requirement for your system that you use some alternative database or data store, or like a non-relational database, it's a lot of work to get that to cooperate. You can kind of pull it off because it uses a provider model, but even in that provider model, again, the bias is toward a relational data store. So they said, how can we improve the way that we're persisting and managing the data related to identity, so that we can make it more flexible? And the way that they did that was they built identity around using Entity Framework code first. And so now everything that Entity Framework can do in terms of leveraging various types of data stores, now identity can do that as well. Another big area was OWIN integration. So who's familiar with what OWIN is? Okay, it's kind of, this is something that's come out fairly recently. And OWIN is the Open Web Interface for .NET. And you can really think of this as like middleware. So the idea is that they wanted to kind of decouple things in a way where now you could have a very kind of modular, pluggable sort of relationship between your application and services that it would use. So for example, in the context of .NET membership, what is the namespace that all the membership stuff lives under, right? It's system.web.security.membership. Okay, so it lives under system.web, and what that sort of, the implication of that is that if you're building a browser-based web application, you're in great shape, because that namespace is sort of, you know, tightly coupled into that. But if you're using like a web API scenario or some other environment where you don't have that browser UI and that cookie tracking kind of thing, ASP membership kind of falls apart in those scenarios. And so OWIN provides some, you know, it kind of extracts authentication and login handling out from under system.web so that it can be used very easily across all of the different forms of ASP.NET applications. And so that's kind of the last point is, you know, again, Microsoft has kind of issued this one ASP.NET kind of idea where they want to kind of take what's common across the board, but then give a lot of flexibility for, you know, instead of kind of siloing the types of applications, they want to really extract out what's common across those. So the history is relatively short. Again, the first release came out in October 2013 as part of Visual Studio 2013's initial release. Just this year in March, there was the 2.0 release, and this was actually shipped as kind of NuGet only deployment. So, and one of the big things that it added, among several things, was support for two-factor authentication. And so, again, this is the idea that when I'm asking you to identify yourself, a username is great, a password is great, but now I want another piece of information. And what two-factor does typically, the typical scenario, is that the application will issue a message out, kind of a one-time use code. Typically it'll get sent to a mobile device or an email address, and then you have to enter in that second piece of information as part of your login sequence. And again, that's like, okay, not only do you have to be the person and know a piece of information, you have to physically have some asset that can be used to get that code back out. So Identity natively supports two-factor authentication, and again, it's kind of a provider kind of model. So if you want to use SMS messaging, you can kind of plug that in. If you want to use an email-based, you can plug that in. There's some flexibility to that. We were kind of commenting before where Another component that they added into the 2.0 release was something that was already present in .NET membership, and that was like the account lockout feature. So if you have failed authentication several times, it'll suspend the account temporarily. They also added in a feature for email confirmation. So you're probably familiar with this scenario where I register an account and it doesn't sort of get activated until I click through an email to verify that that email address is legitimate and that I own it. So they've included some support for that. And then they added some other things kind of at the code level. The one I remember is like they added iQueryable support to some of the object models, so then it makes it easier to iterate through your user base or your role collections and things like that. So that came out earlier this year, and then the current release that just came out last month is 2.1. And so this was bundled as part of the Visual Studio 2013 Update 3. And it did a number of bug fixes and some performance things, but it also added this thing called the sign-in manager. And so those three items I just mentioned, so two-factor authentication, account lockout, and email confirmation, are now kind of provisioned through the sign-in manager, and that makes it really easy to enable or disable those features in your app. So for our first kind of demo, let's just look at how what this looks like when we get into Visual Studio 2013. So I'm just going to start with a file, new project. And if you're not using 2013, you're accustomed to a screen more like this, where you've got several different kind of templates based on the type of application you're going to create. But as part of, again, this kind of one ASP.NET idea, they just give you one template. And when I start my project, then I get a secondary dialog that says, well, what type of application are you looking to build? And I can sort of enable or disable features as I want. So we'll go ahead and do an MVC app. But this change authentication button here is really kind of where the magic happens for .NET Identity. And if I drill into this, you can see the different types of providers or scenarios that it's going to offer me. So individual user accounts will be what we look at primarily tonight, but that's sort of a database-backed credential, or also with the social login providers. If we look at organizational accounts, this is where we're going to get into Office 365, Azure Active Directory, or an on-premise Active Directory if you're building more of an intranet style type application. And then Windows authentication would be another for really pure kind of intranet type applications, where it's going to recognize your domain credentials from the workstation and pass them to your application. But for today, we'll look at individual user accounts. So we'll get this started to scaffold out this application. And while this is going, I'll comment a little bit about the assemblies we're going to see provisioned in this. So as I mentioned earlier, they've moved things out from under system.web. And so there's really a collection of assemblies for identity, and those have relationship to Entity Framework, and they have relationship to OWIN, but not much else. And so it's a very portable sort of object model. Again, it doesn't have the same kind of dependencies as .NET membership did. So in my new application here, we can see if I look at references, we'll kind of zoom in on this. So again, always do that. Let me start that over. Okay. So these three guys here are the ASP.NET identity assemblies. And then you see down below we have the OWIN libraries. And you can see where now we've got already the hooks pre-configured, pre-made for the social networks or external login providers. And we'll see that in a moment, kind of how those come to life. But if I go ahead and run this application, take a minute for the first load. What's that? part of it, I'm not sure exactly when Entity Framework kicks in to provision the database. Okay. And so I don't know if it's on that first load or we'll see in a moment on the register page. But again, so this is kind of our basic templated application. And we see the identity kind of show up in these two pages here. So we've got a very basic register page where we're just capturing a username and a password. And then on the login page, we see, again, your typical login form. But as you can see here, they've kind of earmarked some space for potentially for external providers. And we'll see that in our next demo. So let me go ahead and register a new account. And so again, I'm not sure. I think maybe this is the point where it provisions the database to write to. By default, again, it uses kind of like SQL Express, so it has a local database file. Go ahead. Yeah.
That was exactly a conversation I recently had with a client. Was this one debate on being called login or sign in? I see that Microsoft is, I guess, wants to do both.
Still, yeah, yeah. So if everyone heard that, he was commenting how the debate over what's the proper term, right? Is it login or is it log on or is it sign in or those things? Yeah, I don't think the jury's settled on that quite yet. What's that?
Yeah,
there you go. Yeah.
It does. That's what Microsoft. Well, if you believe them.
I'm saying it's funny that the code is called sign-in manager, but the scaffolding code generating is the word login.
Yeah. It's probably two product teams who don't know about each other, right? So on my new register, it created my account. It automatically logged me in. And now if I kind of go to my account management form, you see I've got a basic change password. Again, there's some space for these external providers to be represented. So let me log off, and then we'll come in here and let's look at what happened, what identity did. So the first place we'll look again is the database side of things. So the first thing you notice, again, if you're familiar with .NET membership, this schema that gets provisioned out is very light. We've got a basic table for roles, a basic table for users. User roles is kind of that join, so who's assigned what role. Logins, user logins is where we're going to see things happen when we start registering those external providers. And so this will be the join between a local user and an external provider. And then user claims deals with claims-based authentication. And so the idea here is while a role assignment is essentially binary, right? You're either in the role or you're not. And it doesn't get very, to get granularity, you have to have lots of roles defined and check them constantly. Claims authentication allows you to have a much more granular representation of permission. This is like what SharePoint uses, Office 365. So the user claims is, again, once I authenticate and register those claims, then it'll show like you can add but not edit or those types of, it gets to a lower level of granularity for it. So if again, the schema on this table is very, very basic. I've got a username and a password and 5 fields there that get scaffolded out. If I look at the data that got created on my new account, then again, very straightforward. Here's the username. Here's a hashed representation of the password. This discriminator field here, we'll see this in a moment when we look at the actual object model. And so basically this is saying this record is associated to a user of type application user. And then I believe the security stamp kind of gets into the representation of like your last login and your current kind of state of login and things like that. But again, very, very basic. So that's the data side of things. If we look at what happened on the controller when we actually clicked the register button, and drill into this. So again, the first thing we notice is we have an application user object. And if we look at the details of this, it's empty. You see the comment they've already added for us of saying this is where you will add additional profile type information to this object. The identity user that it inherits from, if you can see the namespace there again, so this is coming out of the ASP.NET identity namespace. And this identity user is kind of what matches up with the table we just looked at. The ID field, the password hash, and the username. So again, it starts out very, very minimalistic as we drill into the detail of it. So the next step, or the next component then, is this one here called User Manager. And the User Manager is somewhat analogous to, again, the static classes that were around the membership entry point. So User Manager is kind of the entry point we'll see for getting to that user itself. You can see it uses a generic, so I can pass whatever type of user object I want to it. And again, this is being served out of the identity namespace. One of the things we'll see later on, or we'll talk about a little bit later on, is inside the User Manager are some interfaces that can be overloaded for, like, here's the mechanism for how the passwords are hashed or validated. So we'll mention this a little bit later when we talk about converting an application from membership to identity. Part of that is, in order to preserve existing passwords, you got to do some work here on the hashing side to be able to leverage the existing passwords and make sense of those. But again, this kind of User Manager and, again, the Sign-In Manager kind of falls under this space as well. So the basic kind of tasking here then, we do a create, and in this scenario we're doing a create with a user and a password value. And then the sign-in process. So if we drill into the sign-in, then again, this is a little bit, again, kind of conceptually similar to the forms authentication process, where this is the authentication manager in this space is handling establishing a cookie to show your current state and registering an identity object that can be used for accessing the, who is the currently logged in user, right? The identity of the user itself, right there. Go ahead.
Is there anything built into the user login that would easily let you know if the person's logged in somewhere else at the moment? Is that built into that something we still have to roll ourselves?
It's a good question. There is that on the membership side, right? You can get a user and determine if they're logged in as well. So yeah, I'm not certain of that specifically. Go ahead.
Some of the vulnerabilities of sign-in, stealing credentials and stuff have been through scraping memory these days. Does this have any kind of built-in technology to make sure after you patched it, you've wiped over that memory space? And it has a lot to expect.
Yeah, I've actually not heard of that approach. That's clever.
Yeah, that whole target thing, part of that wasn't just point of service, part of it was actually in your servers scraping memory as it got unencrypted.
Really?
And looking for account numbers.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a good question. I'm not certain of any particular feature addressing that scenario. Again, I think what you would find is in where this specifically says use an external cookie, because again, if we're using this in a scenario where it's not a browser-based application, then we wouldn't have that cookie present. So the session would be managed, and again, if you're using more of like a token-based authentication, where you're passing a token around to the consuming application, then it would probably be managed slightly differently than it would be on a cookie-based approach. So, but yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not certain of how they would prevent that specifically. So so again, the thing is that while there's a lot of similarities conceptually to membership, because it's effectively kind of doing the same thing that membership did, the process that it goes through, the path that it goes through, again, is specific to identity. So let me switch over and we'll talk a little bit about taking this beyond the local user and getting to the social login side of things. And this, has anyone done an application where you build your own tooling to use Facebook or Twitter as a login process? Okay, so you've labored through that. Oh, auth clients, right. So I've done that as well. And what I'm about to demo will make you say, like, well, where were you when I was doing this a year ago, right? Because Microsoft has, like, figured all that out in a very packaged way. But the basic process, if you want to use, and this is true for certainly for Facebook and Twitter, I believe it might also be true for using a live ID. But typically what would happen is that you would go to that social network and create an application inside of Twitter. And when we do that, and we'll see that in a moment, but when we do that, then we're basically telling Twitter, like, here's someone who's going to request authentication or request access to a user's account. And what Twitter will give back to us is a set of keys that we will register on our application to say, okay, here's what you provide to prove that you have the ability to access someone's account on their behalf. So if we switch over to the browser, and we'll go here. So for Twitter, it's apps.twitter.com, and I'll log in as with my Twitter account here. And so you can see here I've set up an identity application definition, and so you can describe it and put some descriptive information on it, but what we really care about are a couple things. One is what is this application permitted to do, and so we can specify read-only mode, which would say I can read that user's Twitter feed and I can read that user's follower list, but that's all. Read and write then says, well, I can read those things, but then I could also post a tweet on their behalf. And then you can see the last one includes post direct message to a user. So when we tell Twitter, hey, here's an application that is going to connect to you, we specify like what depth of access that has. And then the other part we have are these API keys. And so this is, again, going to identify our application to Twitter when the user sort of proceeds through to use it. One thing I will point out that I found on the settings is they have this value called callback URL, and it's an optional field, but if you leave it blank, you probably will get like a 404 type error when you try to run your application. It just needs to have a value. I mean, we're going to be connecting from localhost, so we're not actually calling back to this URL, but it wants to have a value here to kind of close the loop on the redirect back to our application. Yeah, and I've had other scenarios where when you make the authentication request, you provide a callback destination at that point, and then it will compare the two to see if they're the same. So that's, I think, part of it as kind of a verification to say, we don't want to redirect to some third party as well. But anyway, if you'll find if you try this, that putting a value in this field, again, even though it's not required, might make things work. So once I have my keys established, if I come back over to Visual Studio now, the place where this is all kind of registered in, is under the app start section here, and we have this one called startup.auth. And so this is really kind of where Owen comes into play. Essentially what this process is doing is sort of registering the plugin modules that our application is going to use. And so for us, we're going to come in and we'll put our Twitter keys in. So these were the keys from that application that we just looked at. So just by adding this code, if I do a build and rerun the application, just this one line with the keys present, we'll see will be enough to unlock Twitter as an external authentication source. So again, for those of us who have gone through this process manually and figured out, well, there's a lot of client-side JavaScript, there's a lot of dialogue that has to be managed between our application and the external application. Now we put in one line of code, and now we have this button that says log in with Twitter. If we click on that, this should bring us over to Twitter and say, okay, I'm the Twitter user. Do you want to give this application permission to access your account? And based on the settings that we had, it's going to list out what this application has permission to do and what this app does not have permission to do. And we can decide whether we want to grant access to it or not. Twitter's pretty simple. Facebook actually is a little more involved because it exposes a lot more information about your account. For example, Twitter will not, I believe, not ever give back the email address of the user as a value. They just don't expose it. Whereas Facebook, you can actually build up a request that says, well, these are the fields of information that I want to get from the user's profile. And so, again, that would all be part of the app settings on the Facebook side to determine our application wants access to email address and to the friends list and things like that.
Is Facebook using all? If they're using Facebook on that, what they're using their own protocol?
I think they've changed. I think you're right. I mean, I think over time Facebook has made some changes to the mechanics of how their login is working. But the process is similar. You register an app on the Facebook side and then provide the keys to our application, and it'll connect up to it. Yes, sir.
When using, let's say we wanted to use your TRINUG application, and it was going after Facebook credential, we were saying log in with Facebook. Mm-hmm. I've encountered the situation where it says, yeah, we're going to get access to your friends list and all of this kind of stuff. Is there a way to tell Facebook, no, don't? You can authenticate me, but don't give this application any information other than I am who I say
right.
I am. Is there that ability
I think,
to block?
Yeah. So did everyone hear the question? So this is kind of an all or nothing check here, right? So if I give access to this, to my account, to this application, it gets everything it says it's going to do, whether it uses it or not, but it's going to get that access. And the question is, can you be more granular about that? Again, the short answer I think is no, that the application is going to establish that permission list. What we do see is once I approve this, and it brings us back to our application, if I come to my actual Twitter account, and Facebook is the same way, but I will see a list of apps. So these are all the apps that I have granted permission to my account. And I can come in and revoke access to it, and then that will break the authorization. So so that's a way I could
but you're at that
claim
point,
it back.
At that point, you've already been mined.
Potentially, yeah. So yeah, it is a little bit of a dynamic of you are in control to the extent that you decide whether they get access or not, and if you give it, then you have the ability to retract it. But once they've received that permission, then whatever the app has been granted, then they would be able to leverage that. So yeah, question over here.
If you were to come in here and revoke access, and then later thought, oh, I really do want to log back
Yep.
into that website that I had originally set up with Twitter authentication, is there any way to reconnect to that site?
Yeah. So the question is, if I revoke, can I have a second chance, basically, to grant access? And the answer is yes. So let's flow this through, and then we'll see how that looks. So I hit Twitter, I gave permission to the app, and then it redirected me back to my application. And it's presenting me now, just a verification to say, this is the username that you're going to have on this application. Is that okay? And we'll say register on that. So again, it's logged me in. And now if we look at this account management page, it's a slightly different presentation. And what's interesting is that it's offering this create local login. And so the idea here is that it's giving you the opportunity to say, hey, well, someday I might quit Twitter, but I don't want to orphan this login. So if I put a password in here, then it will allow those credentials to be used directly to the application, even though they originated externally. And we see that in the database. If we look at the database now on the users table, and refresh this. So in my users table now, we see I've got a username but no password. So the user record is still valid, and everything that Identity does with that user record will still work. It's just the specifics of how the authentication event occurs is going to be slightly different. And so if I were to log out and then come back to the login form and try to use that username with some password, it's not going to match. It's not going to find it because there's no local password that it can use. So to your question, now if I come and I revoke access to this application, now I'm back on my side and I click on Twitter again, I should be re-presented with that do you want to give permission prompt again. So it will always re-prompt me to grant access if I don't already have access assigned. Once I give that access, the follow-on login event, if I do log off and then log in again, this should hit Twitter and come right back. So I don't have to grant access to the application every time. Once I have provided that, it'll remember it, and it'll if I'm logged in on Twitter, it'll recognize those credentials and send me right back to the application. Question in the back.
What code generated that list of permissions? Was that Twitter's code or your code?
That was Twitter's code, yeah. So again, it's based on, if we look at this guy here, again, this is how I'm defining the application on the Twitter side. Based on the selection I make on this access page, is going to translate into what the user sees as this is what the app has permission to do. And again, Facebook has a very similar kind of model for granting that. Yes, okay.
In the users table that you showed us, it looks like there isn't anything that says this is a Twitter username. So does that mean you can't use Smith Derrick again either as a native user or as a second Facebook user?
So, good question. Thank you. So the question is, how does the application know that this record is an external login? And the answer is that there is this user logins table, and that's the join between the local user record and the external authentication provider. So this key value is a Twitter issued key for my account, which means I was possibly the 209th millionth registered user on Twitter, right? If I also log in through Facebook, then I would get another entry in this table to say, okay, you've also got a Facebook, you've also got a Google, you've also got a Windows Live. So this is where those are matched up. Okay. Yes, sir.
So does that mean that if you create a local login, for example, so you say you set up a Twitter and then you decide to have a local login and then revoke Twitter, and then you go, maybe I wanted to do Twitter again, would it automatically reassociate that Twitter login with your local login account?
I believe so. So the question is, again, we're sort of dancing, how many combinations of login and register can we get?
It's just an irritating thing to have to deal with.
Yeah.
So if it doesn't normally.
So let's look. So if I log back in as my local account, right? That was this one. What happens here now is on my management page, I can still use Twitter here. And this will do the same presentation. Will probably, because I'm logged into Twitter, bounce me right back and say, sorry, that account's already has an external. That Twitter username is already associated to a local account, I think is what happened there. If I went and revoked access on the Twitter side, it would probably flow through and allow me to associate this local account with the Twitter account. Yes, sir.
So would you be able to explain to us how we can now use this to make calls to Twitter on behalf of that user? How do we extract the OR?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, now that we have permission for this application to interact with the user's Twitter account, how do we do that, right? And it's a little bit out of the scope of this session, but the idea is that typically it would probably key off of that, that provider ID field to say, okay, when I go to post a tweet, for example, I have to give back, you know, that ID to show who the Twitter user is. If we looked at Fiddler or the sessions here, there's probably also a token that Twitter issued back to us that represents the authenticated state that would then be passed along in the call. I think that's how Facebook works, is you get a token that you have to provide on the subsequent interaction with that account.
My question was if you know how to extract that token easily at pro level.
Let's see what's in here. Facebook keeps changing things. You know, let me come back to that. I know a lot of times, again, it'll be a cookie-based value that you can check for, or in some cases, if you noticed when we received the call back from Twitter, that calls to this external login callback method, and so in this code is probably where you could intercept and capture that token.
Can we run it once more?
Here?